Hi, Steve Andrews, Outlaw Bookseller here, author of 100 must-read science fiction novels, a handy overview, not a best of, not a favourite, not a top, but an overview in 100 books of the major themes of SF and the genre in general, how you can distinguish it looking at thematically and historically. It's not a list book. It is a list book, but it's not a list book in the ranked sense of subjective measures like best and what have you. It's a must read in that if you read these 100 books or read about them in this book, including the important introduction, then you get a good overview of what SF is. Introduction by Christopher Priest, so there you go. So that little plug aside, because it's still in print and still seems to be selling, which is nice, I want to talk today in a fairly off-the-cuff and freewheeling manner about a key concept of SF. So this is the second in my sort of key elements of SF series. So if you've not seen the first one, which is about conceptual breakthrough, do watch that one first, as this one will consequently be much easier to understand, because I don't intend to keep repeating each of the building blocks as we go along. If you watch the series, you'll get it. There is a link at the end of the video, so you can move to that, to the first one in the series. And what I'll do with that first one is I'll link back to this one. I'll change that link. So there we go. So a little while ago, I talked about conceptual breakthrough and what that is. And I talked about something called paradigm shift. Paradigm shift is the key indicator of SF as the literature of change caused by scientific means or means deemed scientific by the author in recognition of the scientific mindset and worldview. The paradigm is a worldview, a consensual look at reality that we all more or less agree with. And what we've seen as technology has risen, it has caused various paradigm shifts as technology creates new possibilities. Look at a simple everyday one like the mobile phone. The things you can do on a mobile phone that weren't possible through other tech 20, 30, 40 years ago, it's caused enormous social changes, and it's made life easier in some ways, more difficult in others. So that's a classic example of a paradigm shift caused by a bit of technology. So if we talk about paradigm shift, our worldview expanding and changes as technology changes the possibilities, then we're really looking at the agent of that paradigm shift, and that is called the novum. All SF features at least one novum. Novum means new thing. It's the presence of the novum, and a novum which is new, hence technological, that makes SF SF as opposed to fantasy or any other kind of genre. I'm going to discuss fantasy in relation to the novum at another time, but let's take it as read at the moment that the novum, the new thing, the new technical or social innovation, because of course the social human sciences are sciences as well. We understand them scientifically. They're not part of superstition or magic, or they shouldn't be. If they get too non-objective and irrational, then they're not social science. There's something else. Then we need to look at those things and how those changes, the introduction of a novum, shifts our paradigm into a new way of looking at the universe. And this is what SF is really about, and this is what distinguishes it. I want to talk about this in some depth because I want to get you to have a look at the SF you're reading and spot the novums. And it's obvious. And I think we live in a time where everybody thinks they know what science fiction is, but everybody's uncertain about what the edges are. So you can't really talk about SF with any authority or expertise or any true idea unless you start to look at the edges. And you can only do that once you've looked at the centre and you're clear on what science fiction is. Now, most people, unfortunately, get the vision of what science fiction is from screens, from film, television, pictures, what have you. The thing with SF wasn't named science fiction until 1926. And of course, by then we already had a basic form of television was invented, and we had the cinema screen. So science fiction is a genre which has grown up with other technology. It's appeared in other technologies, and that's because science fiction is a product of technology. It didn't really exist before the Enlightenment and the rise of the scientific method and recognition of a scientific paradigm where we saw religion, the supernatural, the superstitious start to recede. So it's all related. So it's quite understandable, because of the rise of the mass media in the years just before science fiction was named, that we get a vision of SF which is based on its presence in other media. However, as Peter Nichols, the editor of the Encyclopedia of SF, pointed out, God rest his soul, sadly he's no longer with us, one of my heroes, he said that, you know, SF is very, very good about ideas, and that's what it's really about. Cinema is great at images and visuals, but it's not very good at conveying ideas, because you need words, you need verbal communication. So it has to come through in title cards, which can be clunky, or it has to come through in dialogue, which is the clever way to do it, and that's how people like David Cronenberg do it. So let's look at some examples in SF of a paradigm shift, and some unique ones. And we look at some famous books and some less famous books. All I've done, this is not a top 10 again, I've just picked 10 books, not at random, but I've just gone round my shelves quickly and picked out some things which will enable me to talk about paradigm shift and for us to see what it is. Let's begin with a famous example. One of the most famous examples is, of course, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Now, I'm not going to show you a copy of that. Instead, I'm going to show you a copy of a door book, which is a German book by somebody called Egon Friedel, called The Return of the Time Machine. And I picked this up a while ago, and I think it was written about 1940, and it's dreadful. It's the most irritating, annoying book going. It does have some interesting stuff about time, but it's dreadful. So don't bother, really, honestly. So there you go. But The Time Machine. You know, I think there probably were some time travel narratives prior to Wells, but Wells really nailed the idea of time travel. So that was his first book, his first sortie. He worked on it on and off for years and years and years as a short story and developed it. And I don't think he ever really improved on that. And of course, it contains social commentary, metaphors for class in the Eloi and the Morlocks. But the whole idea of travelling in time has been a staple trope of SF. And these days, people feel that they can describe or recognise SF just by naming obvious tropes. The robot, the spaceship, time travel, alternate history, so on and so on and so on. Some of those things are formed into subgenres, but as paradigm shifters, they're all getting quite old, and this is the whole point. The novum, which causes paradigm shift, is a new thing. But as SF, as a social base, you can look at any number of things in any number of books and see how society has changed through the novum, and it's quite exciting stuff. So let's just pick some examples. Right, this book here, right next to me, is Windows by D.G. Compton, which is the sequel to Compton's most famous book, The Continuous Catherine Mortenhoe, which looks like this. And it's available in a Gollancz Masterwork in the UK and a rather beautiful MYRB Classics edition in the USA, which is the preferred one. I haven't got one because I've got hardcover first and what have you. And this is a sequel, which I decided to show you because you see it less. It was also filmed by Bernard Tavernier in about 1981 as Death Watch. It's a fairly sort of arty-worthy film, but it is good. So, and I think it's available on Blu-ray now. So what is the novum of D.G. Compton's stories in The Continuous Catherine Mortenhoe and Windows? What is the paradigm shifter? What changes the world to you know, through the medium of the story? Well, the first of the two books was published, I think, about 72. And they're about reality television. And in The Continuous Catherine Mortenhoe, you have a world in the near future where illness and death from illness is quite uncommon. It's more of a utopian society, and there is a woman called Catherine Mortenhoe who develops a incurable disease, and this is sort of turned into a public spectacle. A reporter called Rod gets cameras fitted into his eyes, unknown to Mortenhoe, and basically he follows her around the country and teams up with her and becomes her confidant after she decides to skip out at an agreement to appear in a reality show where she will be filmed in her stages of illness and death, because it's such an uncommon thing. It's become a public spectacle. It's become a novelty. It's become a new thing. Novel, novelty, novum. You notice it's all about the new. So there you go. So that's basically the idea. And Rod goes after, he's got these cameras in his eyes, and it's all about the moral questions around that. And this is the sequel, which is rather beautiful. You don't see it very often. So first of all, you see there a moral change, a social science change. How would our world be changed by, first of all, the elimination of most diseases, and then by this sort of intrusive surveillance and reality television? And this wasn't the first reality TV thing. I think the earliest one I've come across, I guess there's echoes of it in Brave New World, and also in Fahrenheit 451 as well, where Montag's wife has huge screens on the walls and she interacts. She's part of a sort of interactive soap opera that's going on. This is a long time before the TV series Big Brother and the reality TV we take for granted now. So it's quite an interesting thing. And an important early one is actually from television, and that's Nigel Neal's play The Year of the Sex Olympics, which again is set in a future where basically, you know, everybody is kind of spoon-fed entertainment. The language has declined. People aren't reading anymore, and they have to be shown more and more sensational entertainment. There's a thing called the Sex Olympics, and that's not enough for them. So what happens then? A new show is posited where a couple are put on an island and a serial killer is released on the island, and it's all filmed through cameras and broadcast live. So there's an interesting thing. So there's a classic example of SF anticipating what the sort of thing that's actually happened. So that's kind of a kill game thing, the Nigel Neal one. So, and recently I probably posted it by now, I think I will have. There's a video on my channel reviewing Nigel Neal's book Tomato Cane, for those of you who are more interested in that. So there's one example. Just to look at a few more, I mean, one of the classic examples of paradigm shift caused by a novum, by a new thing, is of course First Contact. And we're familiar with First Contact. Murray Leinster did a story called First Contact back in about 1940. And of course, it's long been a staple of SF, even before science fiction was called science fiction. If you go back to things like Micromegas by Voltaire, and even back to the true history of Lucian of Samosata, which is way back in the classical period, it's always been a thing. Are there people on other planets? What would it be like when we meet them? And one of the great First Contact books, except that it does a new thing on top of the new thing, is Stanislaw Lem's Solaris. This is a Penguin omnibus here, which I bought way back in the 80s in King Penguin, of Solaris, The Chain of Chance and A Perfect Vacuum, and three very different books. And Solaris, of course, has been filmed twice, made into a TV series in Eastern Europe once, and you'll be familiar with it. And I would say the best version is the Tarkovsky version, though I would say nothing substitutes for the book, which I wish Faber would reissue in hardcover, because it would be really nice to us. But the only SF novel they still have on their list, and it would be great for them to do that, because we could do with a nice hardcover reissue of Solaris. And if you're unfamiliar with the plot, it's about a scientist sent to a space station which floats above the surface of the planet Solaris, where it has been discovered around about a century before the protagonist's birth that there's an ocean which is sentient and it's a living thing. And there have been all sorts of attempts to make contact with Solaris, and it just doesn't happen. And Lem has done this a lot. He does this in Fiasco, he does it in his Master's Voice, and he deals with the problem of knowledge. If you're interested in Lem's work in that aspect, I regard that as a kind of trilogy. There is a video on the channel called Stanislaw Lem, The Problem of Knowledge, and he looks at some of his other work, and he's a fascinating writer, really is. So I would say look at that. Now, the interesting thing about Solaris, of course, is that you see a lot of first contacts and narratives, and it's a very interesting theme, and it's a perennial one. We keep going back to it. So it's quite unusual for anybody to come up with something new. And of course, in Peter Watts' Blindsighted, you have that wonderful thing where they're aliens, but they don't actually have consciousness, so you can't really communicate with them. And the way to deal with a trope that's so well established, like First Contact, you get very mysterious things like Solaris, and you get mysterious things like 2001, where there isn't quite the connect. They don't actually get to talk. Another one of my favorites is If the Stars Were Gods by Benford and Eklund. But this is really good because the communication happens, but in a very tangential way. So that's a great example of paradigm shift. We have an alien life form. We have first contact. First contact isn't a new idea at this stage in SF, but it becomes a new idea through exploring the difficulty of non-contact and what it means for us, and will we always be alone? So that's quite an interesting one, and it is something which is discussed in SETI circles, you know, so it's an interesting thing. So that's a famous one. So, you know, once you've done a sort of entry level first contact, look at something like Solaris, and it really make you think more deeply about the issues involved. So it is quite a complex one. So that's another trope through which we recognize SF. Going back to time travel, Kurt Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse 5, amazing book. I mean, it's really famous. Loads of people who don't read SF read it. Of course, it's loosely based on Vonnegut's own experiences in World War II. He was fighting in Germany. He was captured by the Germans. He was imprisoned in an abattoir in the city of Dresden. He was billeted in there with other American soldiers. And one night, the huge firestorm, the British dropped loads and loads of bombs on Dresden, and it was an absolute conflagration, and the inferno killed. You know, some say that it killed more people than it killed in Hiroshima. I'm not sure if that's strictly accurate, but it sort of burned the city sort of pretty much to the ground and destroyed it. And this really upset Vonnegut almost as much as everything else he'd seen in the war. So he crafted this novel, which is about a young man called Billy Pilgrim who becomes unstuck in time. And he becomes unstuck in time because later in his life, he is abducted by an alien race called the Tralfamadorians, and they basically take him off to a zoo on their planet, and they put him in a sort of glass bubble, a habitat with a beautiful starlet from Earth called Montana Wildhack. And, you know, the Tralfamadorians are looking forward to seeing some hot action, you know, and they're entertained by the antics of the Earthlings. Now, this all happens disjointed, and time is out of joint, and it's a non-linear narrative. And basically the message of the book, and if this is a spoiler, forgive me, turn off now, is that, you know, Vonnegut's philosophy is, you know, you will have lots of bad things happen, but try and concentrate on the good times. Now, the Tralfamadorians, they experience time differently to us. Instead of it being an arrow of time moving forward through space, they experience everything simultaneously. So they have developed this philosophy to say, okay, well, we've got all this stuff. There's the bad stuff. We can see the good stuff. Let's just focus on the good stuff, the nice stuff. And it's just, you know, it's such a workable philosophy, but, you know, sometimes it's the only way you can get through life. And it's a very wise book. And each time I read it, I love it more. So one thing that's in that is the time travel thing, but it relates to something called the block universe theory. And if you look up block universe, I'm not a physicist. It's hard for me to explain it well, and I wouldn't do a good job. There are some great YouTube videos out there, and you can read about it in books and online. And there's a great book by a German lady whose name escapes me. Her book is called Existential Physics, and I'm not sure if it's out yet, but she's done some great videos. So look her up. And there's one that she did about, you know, does now exist? Does the past still exist? I'll try and put a link in the video. And she talks about the block universe, which is basically the idea that everything has happened, or at least everything in the past and present has happened, and that, you know, it's just our perception of things. And you will have heard this idea. And Slaughterhouse 5 deals with that beautifully. So it puts a really human spin on it. So once you've read that book, you can then think, well, is there anything in this? And you can look at the actual science, and it really does make you think. It's fantastic stuff. So read Slaughterhouse 5 anyway. Try and find something about the block universe, and it'll enlighten you and entertain you and get you thinking. And, you know, you'll see that humanism and science are not incompatible. Again, thinking about time and what's happened in the past, one of the classic paradigm shifts is that of alternate history. Now, we're seeing alternate or alternative history. I tend to say alternative history popping up in all sorts of usages. You'll see it in all sorts of things. You'll see it used for Fortean things and what have you, and for radical views of history and what have you. People not from the SF community, especially in the military history things, started calling it counterfactual. But, you know, the thing is, we got it first and we called it alternative history. And here is one of the finest alternative histories in the history of the genre, and that's Pavan by Keith Roberts. It's not a first. I don't have a first. A first is rare and expensive. I've read it many times. This is a Gollancz reprint from the 80s, I think. And if you're not familiar with this, check it out. The most famous alternative history, aside from Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle, which this one and High Castle regarded as the things. And just get that unsightly note off there, which I was using as a prompt. And in the back there, I think I put a little penguin postcard of the King Penguin B format cover of Pavan, which is the first one I bought. And basically, alternate history, or alternative history, as I should say, is that thing where you take a moment in the past where a change happened, a scientifically explicable change, and for some reason it doesn't take place. And in Pavan, and also in Kingsley Amos's The Alteration, which is another fantastic example, what you get is the idea that the Spanish Armada succeeds, Queen Elizabeth is assassinated, and that happens in the opening lines of Pavan, which is beautifully written. And as a consequence, Catholicism comes to dominate Britain. You don't get Henry VIII, the Tudors, and the Reformation, the rise of Protestantism. You have Catholic dominance, and as a result, science, the growth of science, is slowed down, because of course the Catholic Church didn't like science. They didn't like Galileo or Copernicus. They didn't like this idea of, you know, a universe where Earth wasn't the center of things and God wasn't in charge. So you see everything is slowed down, and this is set in 1966, but very different 1966 than the one which we knew. And you're seeing the beginning of the rise of science, as it can't be held back much longer. And it's written in a series of beautifully Hardy-esque vignettes, different tales with different characters in Britain. And as things are starting to change and the church is beginning to lose its grip. And, you know, you can think of all sorts of classic examples. What if JFK had never been shot? Look at World War I. It's generally regarded that World War I was caused by the assassination of Duke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip and his other colleagues, Serbian guys who were sort of outraged about the way things were going in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And because of the different alliances between the British, the French, the Russians, and all the family connections, and the way the German militarism was rising, you know, they all had different alliances, and they all had to decide to sort of stand up for each other or not. And we got, you know, a terrible world war where millions and millions of men died uselessly. So what if that hadn't happened? And if you study it, it's a really interesting example of paradigm shift caused by a single thing. When Princip and his fellow conspirators set out to kill Franz Ferdinand, the Austro-Hungarian heir, what actually happened was that their early attempts using bombs and guns failed. And after the visit in Sarajevo, when Franz Ferdinand was heading back out of the city, his driver, his chauffeur, took a wrong turn into a side street, and Princip had gone into like a cake shop to buy something to eat, and he came out, and it just so happened that he had his shot and he took it. So that's alternative history, and there's all sorts of things that you can think out of that. Now, some people say, is that science fiction? Well, of course it is. It's cause and effect. So alternative history is science fiction. And this is one of the finest examples. If you've never read Keith Roberts, this is the classic place to start. It's probably the only one that's in print, and I would say do read it. And it's a famous book, but it's still not famous enough, and it's still not read enough outside of English literary SF circles. Another example of paradigm shift is, of course, climate change. And it's interesting because, of course, particularly in British literary SF, climate change in the form of the Great English Catastrophe novel, or disaster story, or whatever you want to call it, because of our English obsession with the weather and the climate, because we live in a temperate area, so we don't, you know, it changes all the time. In temperate zones, people talk about the weather a lot. And we're particularly keen on it in Britain because of our sort of social unease, supposedly. I'm Welsh, it doesn't affect me in the same way. I'll talk to anybody, and, you know, that's what we're like. But the thing is that, of course, climate change fiction, it's been predictive. And, there's this term around now, cli-fi, which I really, really hate. And it's invented by somebody in the book trade who wrote to the Bookseller magazine or something. And it's Johnny-come-lately stuff, it's been going for a long time. So it goes right the way back to sort of like the 19th century and before. And people started to speculate around about the time of the Industrial Revolution that it could be dangerous. So that fed into literature. This is one of the classic examples of climate change fiction or catastrophe novels, and this is J.G. Ballard's The Drowned World. So the narrative goes in these things. There's John Christopher, Wrinkle in the Skin, or There's Suddenly Lots of Earthquakes, or Winter's Children by Michael Coney, and there's a similar one by Christopher. And there's The Snow by Adam Roberts, where it's winter time again, it's an ice age again, classic sort of stuff. This one, of course, is about the idea that there's solar flare activity or something like that, and Ballard sort of just chucks that in a paragraph, and it's just a little excuse. It's a novum, it's a new thing to shift the paradigm so we can tell a story. So let's remember, we are talking about fiction. Fiction is a game, and it's there to entertain us and to make us think, and that's the beauty of SF. It's not just entertainment, it's to make you think as well. And of course, what have we seen? We're seeing sea levels rising, climate change is happening. So this is 1962. This is the Liverite 50th anniversary edition, nice reissue. And, it's a great book. And so, when Ballard did this, it was sort of that thing, it's established. John Wyndham did one, but in that case, the Kraken Wakes, you've got the Bathies, the aliens coming down to Earth. They splash their spaceships into the water and they melt the ice caps and everything raises because they are amphibious creatures, or rather they really are sort of benthic. And so what was new about this? Well, of course, aside from that initial paradigm shift, it would have been familiar, except Ballard, being an absolute genius and understanding the psychological reasons why people love disaster novels, he decided to make Kerens, his protagonist, eventually towards the end of the book, accept the catastrophe and follow his impulses, which were, instead of going north with all the survivors, was to head into the sun and embrace the reptilian side of his brain and to embrace the change, no matter if it meant the end of his physical body and destruction. So that was a really, really good example of paradigm shift. And as it becomes towards the end of the book, it's then a great example of conceptual breakthrough. Now, as I said in the other video, paradigm shift and conceptual breakthrough, they're related and they're pretty much the same thing. But I use conceptual breakthrough to really show a new idea coming through in a big way. So in this, you get the paradigm shift of the changed climate, and the conceptual breakthrough is Kerens' embrace of the disaster, which was a new thing in the disaster novel. And of course, he repeated again then in The Drought, which is my favourite of his initial tetralogy, because of course there are 4 books. The first one was The Wind from Nowhere, which has been suppressed by the Ballard estate for many years, so it hasn't been editions since the 70s. And the 4th one was The Crystal World, where things were getting even more metaphoric. This is my favourite. I actually think The Drought is a better written book than The Drowned World, but of course this is sort of Protean one. This is the famous one. And really, he does this great thing in this where he talks about, again, it's one paragraph and I can't find it, or I'd read it to you. And he talks about polymers bonding unexpectedly from industrial waste on the surface of the ocean. And they bond so strongly, even though everything is still flapping around, that they deflect the sunlight off the water. Water doesn't, rain can't fall, and even though the water is evaporating, no rain is coming out because of these polymers, and of course a drought ensues, and it's absolutely brilliant. It really is. And in The Wind from Nowhere, which is to me is even more revolutionary in some ways, because the wind comes from nowhere and it's never ever explained, and that's a very bold thing to do in SF, and it's a very metaphoric thing, but it's very, very, very bold that a wind could come from nowhere, and the scientists are looking for where it's come from and why it's doing that, and it pretty much destroys the world, and they never do. So that's science you, it's always questing. So there's a classic example of a little paradigm shift at the beginning of the book, and then a big one at the end, which is conceptual breakthrough. So, and cracking stuff. If you haven't read it, do. Ballard, absolute genius, changed SF. In a similar ballpark, and a very, very enjoyable read, and a very original one, and a very poetic one, is Brian W. Aldiss's Hothouse. Now, as my friend Jim Goddard pointed out on this Good Child edition, it has Hothouse, and that's not the title. The title is Hothouse, one word. These are uncommon. The Good Child SF Alternative series, they only did 6, and I've got 3 of them. I wish I'd bought them all at the time. They did Beast by John Crowley, fantastic book. Tiger by Alfred Bester, aka The Star's My Destination, the boring title, and I've got that in this edition. This Immortal, aka And Call Me Conrad by Roger Zelazny, which I could have bought easily, but I didn't because I've got a leather-bound Eastern Press one. The World of Null A by A. Van Vogt, which I wish I had bought. And The Space Merchants by Frederick Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth, 6 series. These are quite good. Some of these were in print till comparatively recently. I was actually selling the Bester one till about 3 or 4 years ago. At 8, I think it was £8.95, and it'd gone up to about £12.99. And a wholesaler had them in stock, and dealers were selling them for 50 to 100 quid, and it was still in print. There's the Zelazny and the Bester. So there you go. So this is Hothouse. What's the story with Hothouse? Well, Hothouse is one of the most imaginative books I've ever read. It's beautifully written. I regard it as one of Aldis's big 4. Like Silverberg, for me, he's got a big 4. Aldis has a big 4, and we'll talk about those again. But they're basically this, Greybeard, Frankenstein Unbound, and what's my other big 4 of Aldis? Let's have a look. Greybeard, Frankenstein Unbound, this one. Anyway, we'll come back to it. You know, getting old, you see, this is the trouble. And the idea in Hothouse is that distant future, climate change, the Earth has stopped rotating, so only one side of it faces the sun, the other side is dark. The side that faces the sun, because of the radiation, plants have mutated, animals and plants have sort of hybridized, or plants have become more like animals. Mankind has shrunk, turned green, and taken to the trees. It sounds ridiculous, I know. And some people say Hothouse is a fantasy novel. Long Afternoon of Earth was the title in America when it was a magazine serial, won the Hugo Award, around about 1960. And I'm just going to read you the first paragraph, which I think is absolutely beautiful. Obeying an inalienable law, things grew, growing riotous and strange in their impulse for growth. The heat, the light, the humidity, these were constant and would remain constant for, but nobody knew how long. Nobody cared anymore for the big question that began, how long or why? It was no longer a place for mind. It was a place for growth, for vegetables. It was like a hothouse. And I just think that's magnificent. And it's so imaginative, and the lead character Gren is a little guy, and like that's my other big fall, it's non-stop, like Roy Complain in Non-Stop. Gren is this rather grumpy little chap, and he's got bags of attitude, and he falls out of the tree that they all live in, and he goes on this Hegira, this odyssey, this journey across this strange new world of plant animals, and Aldis invents all sorts of wonderful language, and the world building, which is not normally my thing, is fantastic. So that's a great example of really extreme paradigm shift, where you get this cosmic thing, where the Earth stops moving in its axis, and it causes all these massive changes. Life goes on nonetheless, and evolves, devolves, revolves, what have you, and you get this wonderful picture, and it's just incredible. So it's not really like anything that we'll probably see with climate change, but it is a fantastic read. So it shows how SF has a unique thing through something scientific, something that we dreamed of as possible from our scientific knowledge, as orbits ceasing, axes going off, and you get this wonderful story out of it. So, you know, it's just absolutely marvelous. And that's another great example of paradigm shift, an extreme one. And, you know, it is allied to the Dying Earth school of science fantasy. And are those books fantasy? Well, we'll come to that another time when we address the Dying Earth subgenre of people like Jack Vance, Gene Wolfe, M. John Harrison, what have you. We'll have a look at that another time. But great book if you haven't read it. There's a beautiful Penguin modern classic of it, which I'll try and show you in a moment. And here's the Penguin Modern Classic, which you can get in British bookshops, and lovely edition. It's not a cheap one, it's £10.99. It could be a bit cheaper than that, but it is beautiful. So do read it, because it's a fantastic book. Okay, so paradigm shifts, what else is there? Well, there's all sorts of things, isn't there? I mean, I'm not talking much about space travel, because that's the obvious one, and I think I referred to Philip K. Dick in the conceptual breakthrough video. Philip K. Dick said that space adventure fiction isn't really SF, largely because it doesn't introduce a new thing, a novum. It's an old novum. If it's just spaceships and adventure. But of course, there's lots of great people who've been writing space opera and what have you, and they take FTL for granted, or they come up with a new way of explaining how it would work, and you can get paradigm shifts within them. I don't read a lot of that SF. I don't usually find it entertaining. I do find real physics entertaining. I recently read a book by Linda Nagata called Vast, which was an unusual example of a woman writing a very, very hard SF novel. It wasn't for me, even though I could see it was skillful. So that's not really my jam. And because there's so much emphasis in SF publishing and SF imagery on space opera, I've pulled back from it for this, because there are other types of SF which are very well worth reading. And look at a famous example here of, again, more of a social thing caused by biology, and this is Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness. This is the Masterworks edition in hardcover from about 2000, and it had this cover for years and years and years in the Orbit A format edition, which I've probably got somewhere, which I really love this cover. And this is a really great book. It's very wise, and it made me feel like no other book I've read. And even though I tend to go off Le Guin when she goes into the 80s, she gets a little bit sort of new agey and airy fairy. But I do love her sort of early Hainish books. They're absolutely fantastic. And the basic idea of this, the Hainish universe, is mankind moves out into the stars, realizes that there are people everywhere. They've been seeded by a race called the Hainish, who could be their progenitors. And basically they form a kind of galactic federation. It's very Star Wars. And in this, a member of the Federation called Gen I, who is a hero of colour. So, it was happening a long time ago, folks. Identity politics is new in SF. We covered all that off back in the 60s and 70s. Goes to this planet, and everybody on the planet is male, except at a certain time of year, some of them go into season and become female. So it's got transgender. It's not really transgender, it's more intersex, and it's biology, because the planet's very harsh, it's icy, you can't sort of breed all the time as people do on Earth. And of course, on Earth we are so façoned because we've evolved, because of our relative weakness of our bodies compared to other animals outside. We needed to be able to breed regularly because so many infants would die. Infant mortality was really high, and it still is in many parts of the world. Despite that, we've managed to overpopulate it enormously in about the last 150 years and completely destroy loads of it. So this is an example of paradigm shift. So it does make you think about gender and about reproduction, and it's a beautiful book. And again, there's a wonderful quest narrative in this, and it is fantastic. So the paradigm shift that we're seeing a lot at the moment in society, where we're being asked to think about pronouns and inclusivity and diversity and what have you, it was all done a long time ago in SF. It's nothing new. So SF does prepare us for these things. Or does it? Has it made me more ready to accept sort of changes and deal with things? Well, it's hard to say. I guess it's sort of awakened me to the possibilities, and that's the beauty of SF, the opening up, the conceptual breakthrough that a paradigm shift causes. And of course, the paradigm shift is caused by the Novum. So you see the way it's going. The Novum, the new thing, the new piece of technology or social change, which is caused by technology, leading to a paradigm shift. And then we have to adapt. And in adapting, our individual stories sometimes become conceptual breakthroughs, where there's a second paradigm shift and things broaden again. There's no looking back with SF. It's not like fantasy. It's not about the past. It's about the future, and it's about the way things are and the way they'll change, and the acceptance that whether we like it or not, because of technology and because of the way we're evolving, things will change. So that's a great example of paradigm shift in a gender sort of sense. It's a great, great book, really is. This is a very uncommon edition now, by the way. It's beautiful. I really, really do love this book, and it's something I sell all the time. And there is something about popularity. You think popular books, they're usually the most conservative ones, and I do rail against people going on about Foundation and Dune, because they're okay, but they're kind of entry level, really. They've got great ideas, yeah, but they're not fantastic works of literature, where this is, as is Slaughterhouse-5 and Pavan. So you want the conceptual breakthrough, you want paradigm shift, the Novum, you want all these things. They all make great SF, but why can't we have good writing as well? And this brings me to the mainstream of literature. Now, of course, there are lots of books being published which people say aren't SF, and they are. And that's because those people take their image of what science fiction is from screens, from films, from comics, from TV, what have you. And the focus in film and cinematic, televisual, SF, what have you, is about imagery and showing the images and the beautiful poetry of the images of artists like Chris Voss and Jim Burns. And we all love that because it creates the sense of wonder. It creates a conceptual breakthrough psychologically in our minds. But of course, it is really about intellectual process. So when you're aware of the novum, which creates paradigm shift, and then which further can lead to a greater paradigm shift in conceptual breakthrough, you start to recognize SF in all sorts of places. And it's not just about what's marketed as SF, what's obvious. And that, of course, is genre SF, the SF which comes out of the American pulp magazine school. Science fiction existed before, it just wasn't called science fiction. This is why I like to use SF, because SF can mean anything you want it to. It can mean science fiction, it can mean speculative fiction, though it's not a label I use. It can mean structural fabulation, a sort of technical term. Whenever I say that, I think Robert Scholes came up with it. I always get a laugh when I've used that, talking to the public in bookshops about SF, when I did a tour for my book and what have you. But it's actually quite a good little piece of terminology, and we look at that again. So Tom McCarthy's Remainder. This is Tom's first book. This came out 2006, I think. Let me just have a look at it. This is the limited edition. It's not a first. The first was a French publication. And yeah, Remainder was first published in a limited edition by Metronome Press, Paris, 2005. This is the revised edition, first published by Alma in 2006. And this is signed, and you can see that. I've probably got a bit of glare here. And this is a wonderful book, and he's written a few since. Very interesting character. For me, none of the other books have come up to this one. This is probably his purest and most accessible work, and I urge you to go out and buy it now. There is a film of it, but it's not very good. It's okay, but it doesn't really capture the essence of it. And because it's a film, it has to show things, and it shows too much. And it shows the moment, which is the real sort of nub of the story. It's the moment around the novum and the paradigm shift that comes out of that. The basic idea is that there's this chap and he's strolling along and something falls out of the sky and hits him on the head. And it's a piece of tech. And he's not cold. When he comes around in hospital sometimes later, he's offered a large settlement, I think it's £8.3 million, by the company who were designing and testing this flying bit of tech. And in the film, it's a drone, and that's what's annoying. And it's too mundane. And you're never told in the novel Remainder what it is. This bit of tech either flies or has fallen from something, and it's hit him on the head. But that itself has caused a problem, and he's developed a mental condition as a result of it. It's impaired his mental health. And you learn what that is. And it's that he has developed this strange obsessive focus on memory, and maybe on some memories which aren't real, and on dreams possibly rather than memories. And it's quite sort of opaque and difficult to explain. But basically he inherits this money and he can do whatever he likes, and he buys a house, and he has this recurring vision, this dream or this memory of small details of somebody frying kidneys or liver, I think it is, in the flat downstairs, of a cat walking across a roof, of people doing this in different time, and all these different details of this memory or vision or dream or whatever it is, he decides to recreate them or to create them. And it's almost like a kind of Asperger's syndrome, sort of spectrum type thing. And you get the impression that it's not just caused by the fact he's been hit on the head, but there is something about that piece of tech. And when he signs off for the money, he can't talk about it. So it's kept secret from you as well. So it's really interesting. So my take on it is that it's a piece of tech, so it's science fiction. It's a new thing. And it has caused him to have this condition, not just through the blow on the head, because there's something about the piece of tech which has created this mental state in him. Something hallucinatory, or what, chemical, electrical, who knows? Some mutation, we don't really know. And that's what's fascinating about it. It's a really, really gripping book. It's really easy to read, despite its high concept. It reminds me of the work of people like Christopher Priest and Adam Roberts. And you just follow the narrator on his journey through his obsessions as he employs an assistant, he employs actors, he buys this house to recreate this dream, and then it goes further, and his obsessions, these dreams, memories, visions, whatever they are, they coalesce, and he tries to make them into reality, and it goes from there. And it's absolutely wonderful, and it's got a fantastic ending which I really love, and it sort of ticks all the boxes really. So Remainder is an example of an SF novel employing a novum to create a paradigm shift, and then a conceptual breakthrough of a new sort of behavior, and it's enormously satisfying when he sort of manages to create these scenarios which he's envisioned. It's enormously satisfying for the protagonist. So it's really, really interesting. So that way it's Ballardian as well, in that it's about people's obsessions and making them real. And that is something we found in the modern world as we've had more tech. We're finding ways to make our obsessions flesh, and the new obsessions. And of course, this is leading to all sorts of things. Like, for example, in Japan, people are staying in and they're watching pornography and they're only connecting online, rather like in The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster, which goes way, way back, about 100 years or more ago that was written. And in Brave New World, you know, we're seeing these things. So this is a great example of that, you know, how psychology can be changed by technology. Fantastic stuff. So do read it. I'm going to finish with a really famous book, and I'm going to draw it back to the opening words and something called Infodump. This is Neuromancer by William Gibson, one of the most famous science fiction novels in the world, one of the best science fiction novels I've ever read. For me, it's the best science fiction novel of the last 40 years. I think it's fundamentally important. It was a game changer. I think part of the problem with SF is that we haven't had any game changers like this for a long time. And, you know, at the time when it came out, a lot of us were baffled by what it was about. You know, we really struggled with what was going on and what have you. This is the 10th anniversary edition. This is my reading copy. I tend to read this. I've got various other copies, including a world first hardcover, my original paperback. I got Bill to sign that for me. Gosh, I must have signed that for me in the 90s in Bristol, and I think that was about the third time I met him. And this is actually very uncommon, this edition. I think Cold Tonnage, he's had one on sale recently for 250 quid. So, you know, I need to look after that, though I may actually move it on now I've discovered that. And of course, if you're not familiar with Neuromancer, you really should read it. It's the book which pretty much created the modern world we live in. Some would say that's too bold a claim. I would say it isn't. It's probably set in about late 21st century, 2050, 2070, maybe 22nd. I would say sort of 50 years from now. And it has the absolutely wonderful opening line. Part 1, Chiba City Blues, and of course it takes place in Japan. And the opening line, of course, which is really famous: "The sky above the port was the colour of television, tuned to a dead channel." The sky above the port was the colour of television, tuned to a dead channel. So what does that tell you? Sky, like, you know, if you're familiar with a dead TV channel from those days, you just get like a burst of white noise static, or grey, black and white, sort of what have you. So imagine the sky like that, you know, that tells you something serious has happened, you know, environmental collapse, what have you. And there are a number of novums in this. The most famous one, of course, is the virtual reality world of cyberspace, the consensual hallucination where everybody is linked through computers which form this matrix, and that people can jack in, they can plug themselves, interface with the technology, and their consciousness can be projected into cyberspace. And this was a radical new idea then. But there was something similar in Tron, which is interesting, because Tron is a fairly sort of lightweight movie, but conceptually really interesting. And of course, Tron's about an arcade game, and Gibson said that he had the idea for cyberspace when he watched kids in arcades playing arcade games. Because you know, computer games at home then were so basic, you know, they were virtually non-existent. So you'd have to go to an arcade to play one. And I remember that really, really well. And Gibson said he could see the kids willing themselves to be behind the screen of Space Invaders or Galaxians, whatever, inside the computer. And of course, that's what happens in Tron. So it's a very similar thing to that. So it's a big conceptual breakthrough. And the idea of cyberspace as a consensual hallucination, because Gibson, you know, he's very oblique. He doesn't say, you know, here's the title card of what's happening. There's a little bit where you see a voiceover from a show, either on, you know, it's like a YouTube thing, or maybe it's a TV show, where somebody says cyberspace, the consensual hallucination enjoyed by billions of people every day, and one of the characters says, what's that? And the other says, it's a kid's show. So that's infodump. So that's sort of saying to you, you know, it was a very clever way of putting that necessary information in, unlike a title card on a film. Otherwise, you've got to do it in dialogue. And infodump's one of those things. And science fiction writers will say, well, you know, is it okay to do infodump? And somebody asked John Harrison this when I sort of hosted him about 5 years ago for an event that we did. And he said, yeah, you know, infodump's okay, but it's all about how you do it. And a lot of the time, you know, it's really clunky, and Ballard's really good at it, as I said. and with Gibson he'd do it that way. And because he there's a kind of irony then, it's just a kid's show. He's kind of saying to the world of science fiction reading and science fiction writing, come on, you're dealing with these tired old tropes, get up to date, this is the way the world's going to be, extrapolate, think it through, form new paradigms, look at the way the technology's going, imagine the way it's going to go, start engaging with computer technology instead of everything else, and you go from there. So great examples of the Novum and Paradigm Shift, and of course there's the conceptual breakthrough at the end. Again, this is a spoiler, it doesn't really matter, but of course Case, the protagonist, is working for a character, well, we're not going to spoil it actually, and when that character achieves what it sets out to, there's a big paradigm shift, a big conceptual breakthrough. So that's the Novum and Paradigm Shift. I'll probably talk about the Novum a little bit more. So you see how it's coming together as we move towards defining what SF is. Instead of just saying it's a collection of tropes, it's robots, it's time travelers, what have you. Those are just examples of how writers have used the Novum. The hard thing for SF now is to come up with new Novums. And this is a hard thing for everything in all arts in the modernist period, when we had the rise of mass production and mass reproduction of images, film, television, print, what have you. We're exposed to everything. Nothing is new. There's no novelty anymore. In our lifetimes, we've seen everything. By the time we're 25, we've been exposed to more art than even the richest people in the world could have been before. So it's really hard to be new all the time. And that's one of the curses of modernism. And as we move into a postmodern time, and we recognize that we're not going to get so many paradigm shifts, of new ideas, because so much has been done, we have to sort of look at the craft and things. I'm an old guy. I grew up in the modernist period. I'm used to modernism. I'm used to innovation. I'm used to the new. And this is why a lot of people my age say, well, there's nothing new anymore. We've seen it before. And I've got a friend who, he's very passionate. He always says, well, you've got to look at the quality and get over this idea of originality and what have you. There's still good stuff out there. Look at the craft and the work that people are doing in all sorts of fields and mediums. There's some great stuff. But the problem with SF is it does rely on the Novum, on the new. So I'll leave you with that thought. There'll be more key elements of SF to come. And we look at things like cognitive dissonance, and we move towards a definition rather than a description. And I hope you've enjoyed this. Please subscribe if you haven't. Do hit the like button, because apparently that makes a difference for advertising. So I'm still trying to get a little bit of money to support the channel, and hopefully that will happen soon. I'm very grateful to everybody who's helped me with the music, and friends who've subscribed and what have you, and you, the regular viewers out there. And if you're new to this, please subscribe, and you will get more in-depth stuff about what SF is, and a look at some lovely books as well. So this is Outlaw Bookseller signing out for now. Bye.